In 1996, Capcom helped popularize the survival horror genre with the Resident Evil franchise. Capcom basically held the title of survival horror king unchallenged until Konami threw their hat into the ring with Silent Hill. While Resident Evil drew inspiration from B horror movies, Silent Hill emulated the tone of Stephen King books and movies like Jacob's Ladder, which deals much more heavily with subtle psychological horror, a big contrast from the campy acting and silly situations of Resident Evil.
No! Don't go!
Instead of cliched monsters and cheap thrills, Silent Hill's environment and enemies are personally crafted to reflect the protagonist's own personal hell, which to me heightens the horror atmosphere. I would argue that the first 4 Silent Hill games are leaps and bounds ahead of the Resident Evil games released around the similar times. That's because the team behind Silent Hill didn't want to create just another typical video game, they wanted to create an experience. And they largely succeeded and probably would have dethroned Capcom if it wasn't for 2004's colossal success, Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 changed a lot of the series' most iconic features: tank controls, scarce resources, and fixed camera angles. Making monumental changes to an established series is a huge risk. I mean, what would Call of Duty be without the first-person perspective and the 12-year-olds calling you homophobic slurs? But of course, Resident Evil 4 was a huge success, with more re-releases than Skyrim. And what was Konami's response? A prequel for the Sony PSP. Yay. Konami released 2 Silent Hill games around the same time, Origins and Homecoming, and these were the first 2 dominoes to fall for the franchise. These games somehow managed to simultaneously fail to capture both the essence of Silent Hill and deliver a new experience, which, honestly, is quite the feat. These 2 games released just a year apart from each other and have a lot of Silent Hill firsts. The most notable is how these games prioritize combat over everything else. A combat-focused game worked for Resident Evil 4 given their more B-horror movie roots.
I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
But Silent Hill's greatest strength is their sophisticated horror, which requires much more nuance to successfully execute. Silent Hill walks a delicate balance between atmosphere and gameplay. The series' epitome is when the player feels alone and helpless, like when the main character is some teenage girl or a bad husband, not a burly truck driver who brawls with half-naked nurses. Origins and Homecoming have the same great look as previous Silent Hill titles, but it plays just like any other generic action game, which is a huge slap in the face to fans. The first 4 Silent Hill games had so much love and care put into them, because remember, the original Silent Hill team rejected conventional video game norms in order to create an experience, which is a huge risk. For example, while other series set off to create characters they could recycle, Halo's Master Chief, Tomb Raider's Lara Croft, and even Resident Evil's growing cast, each Silent Hill game typically stars a new character. Having recurring characters helps a franchise in several ways. It builds hype when players are excited to see a character, it expands the lore, and from a business perspective, it saves money. When Capcom is preparing for a new Resident Evil game, they already know who Leon Kennedy or Jill Valentine is. But Silent Hill's characters rarely make multiple appearances, unlike Resident Evil characters who are each playable in like 3 games each. Each Silent Hill game is largely disconnected from the other, making them more of an anthology series like The Twilight Zone or Black Mirror, opposed to Resident Evil that feels more like... The original Silent Hill team created some of the best survival horror games ever. So how did Team Silent drop the ball so badly with Origins and Homecoming? Well, the short answer is they didn't. Origins and Homecoming were developed by Climax Studios and Double Helix Games, making them the first entries not to be made by Team Silent, which explains why so many aspects of these games just feel off. Capcom understands the importance of consistency, which is why no one touches the main Resident Evil series other than Capcom. Therefore, each game builds off the previous one. As early as 2004, you can see how Resident Evil 4 lays the foundation for the remakes. But all could have been forgiven if Homecoming wasn't just so meh. And horror games can't just be meh anymore. Horror games were a small niche in the late 90s. There was Alone in the Dark, Clock Tower, Barbie's Jungle Adventure, but that changed by the mid-2000s with games like Fear, Dead Space, and BioShock, all games that offer a much more satisfying experience than Silent Hill Origins or Homecoming. And by the time these games release, the number of die-hard fans dips significantly. The 15-year-old fan who played the 1999 original was in their mid-20s when Origins and Homecoming released. And while gaming is now a hobby enjoyed by people well into adulthood, there weren't that many geriatric gamers 20 years ago. And without an energized base, Silent Hill was destined for obscurity. Capcom avoided this fate using several strategies. They released Resident Evil on several different consoles, most notably Nintendo, which exposes a much younger, impressionable audience to the franchise. They made past Resident Evil titles easily accessible so newer players could easily get into the series, and their remakes are typically top-tier games. Personally, I got into this series at 10 years old by playing the remake for the Nintendo GameCube, and 20 years later, I bought almost every game. Yet in good old Konami fashion, they basically did the opposite. The first 4 Silent Hill games exclusively released on the PlayStation, the more adult-oriented console. Copies of Silent Hill 1 through 4 was hard to come by. Even the HD remaster, which only included 2 and 3, wasn't even released until 2012. And despite an incredible backlog of games, their first remake was just announced. This is why my 11-year-old nephew can basically explain the entire Resident Evil universe but isn't even aware of Silent Hill. It didn't have to be this way. There were a lot of opportunities for Silent Hill to revitalize the series and remain in the public consciousness, but Konami dragged their feet until they realized that a man for remakes. Unfortunately, it might be too little too late. Thanks to Silent Hill's utter disappearance since Downpour, a game which commits a modern gaming mortal sin with unskippable cutscenes, 2's remake may not be the success Konami's hoping for. This is something people asked for over a decade ago. You can't expect fans patiently waiting like it's Half-Life 3. With the remake and new game announced, Silent Hill has the opportunity to revive itself. But by the looks of the trailers, it doesn't seem like they've learned their lesson, but it's too early to tell. I would love Silent Hill to be a AAA powerhouse again, but my expectations are tempered.